The wind doesn't ask permission. It comes at you sideways, carrying ice crystals that cut exposed skin like glass. Your fingers go numb first, then your feet, then your face stops feeling like your face. And somewhere out there, past the frozen tree line, something large is moving. This is not a story about a disaster. This is the story of your ancestors' everyday life for tens of thousands of years. The last glacial maximum, the coldest and most brutal phase of the last ice age, peaked around 20,000 years ago. Temperatures in parts of Europe and Asia were 12 to 14 degrees Celsius colder than today. Ice sheets stretched across North America and Northern Europe, some of them 3 kilometers thick. And your ancestors were out there, not just surviving, thriving. How? That is exactly what we are going to reconstruct. First, forget everything you think you know about early humans huddling helplessly in caves. The archaeological record tells a different story, a more impressive one. Researchers like Will Rubrooks at Leiden University have spent decades studying the evidence of Ice Age human behavior, and what they found flips the image of the helpless caveman entirely. Your ancestors were not reacting to the cold. They were solving it. Start with fire. Controlled, reliable, strategic fire. Evidence of repeated hearth use during glacial periods has been found at sites across Europe, from Spain to Russia. These were not accidental flames. These were engineered heat sources, positioned in the mouths of rock shelters to reflect warmth inward, surrounded by stones that retained heat overnight. Your ancestors understood thermodynamics before the word existed. But fire only takes you so far when the outside air is lethal. So your ancestors solved the next problem: insulation. Clothing during the Ice Age was not primitive wrapping. It was sophisticated, layered, and tailored. The discovery of bone needles at sites like Kostenki in Russia, some dating back 30 to 40,000 years, tells you everything. A bone needle means sewn seams. Sewn seams mean fitted clothing. Fitted clothing means trapped body heat. Your ancestors were wearing layered animal hide garments stitched tightly against the cold long before agriculture, long before bronze, long before writing. The needle is one of the most underrated inventions in human history. Now imagine you are dressed, you are warm, at least for now, but you are hungry, and in a glacial landscape, food does not come easily. So let's reconstruct a day. You wake before dawn in a rock shelter, shared with perhaps 15 to 30 people. The fire has burned to coal. Someone has already fed it before the rest of you opened your eyes. Outside, the sky is the color of iron. The temperature is somewhere around -15. You dress in layers, hide against skin, fur outward, feet wrapped and bound with cord made from sinew. Then you move, because movement is survival. A hunting party of 5 or 6 sets out across frozen ground, following tracks in the snow. Your prey during the last glacial maximum could have been woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, bison, or horse. Studies of stable isotopes in Ice Age human bones, the chemical signatures left behind by diet, show that large game made up the majority of calories for people living in glacial Europe and Siberia. These were not opportunistic scavengers, they were apex hunters. Hunting a woolly mammoth was not a reckless charge. It was a coordinated, planned operation. Researchers studying sites like Przedmoście in Poland and Mezhirich in Ukraine, where hundreds of mammoth bones were found in organized arrangements, concluded that these animals were hunted systematically and their materials used with extraordinary efficiency. Bones became shelter frames, hides became walls, fat became fuel. A single mammoth could sustain a small group for weeks. But Ice Age survival was never just about one hunt. It was about reading the land across time. Your ancestors tracked seasonal migrations, memorized river crossings where herds would slow down, and returned to the same productive sites year after year. This is not guesswork. The archaeological site of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dating to around 26,000 years ago, shows evidence of a semi-permanent settlement where people returned repeatedly, a base camp for a people who had mapped their entire frozen world in their minds. And here is the counterintuitive twist. The very harshness of the Ice Age may have been one of the most powerful drivers of human cognitive evolution. Surviving extreme cold requires forward planning. It requires storing food, caching supplies, remembering the location of water sources under the ice, and coordinating with other groups over long distances. Evolutionary anthropologist Genevieve von Petzinger, who has studied Ice Age cave markings across Europe, argues that the symbolic and social complexity we see in Ice Age art and material culture is not incidental. It is a cognitive response to pressure. Your brain, the one you are using right now, was in part shaped by the ice. This is something worth sitting with for a moment. The planning centers of your prefrontal cortex, your ability to imagine a future scenario and prepare for it, your instinct to stockpile, to coordinate, to build shelters before the storm arrives. These are not modern habits. They are Ice Age inheritances. Every time you check tomorrow's weather forecast or stock your pantry before a snowstorm, you are running software written in the deep freeze. There was also a social dimension to Ice Age survival that researchers have only recently begun to appreciate. Isolated groups would have died. The evidence for long-distance exchange networks during the Ice Age, shells from coastal regions found hundreds of kilometers inland, amber from the Baltic Sea appearing at sites across Central Europe, tells you that your ancestors maintained relationships across vast distances. These were not random trades. They were social insurance policies. A network of allied groups meant that if your local hunt failed, you had somewhere to go. Someone who owed you a favor, someone who would share. At Sungir in Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried in an elaborate grave filled with thousands of hand-drilled mammoth ivory beads, fox teeth, carved pendants, and tools. The labor involved in producing those grave goods is staggering. Researchers estimate the beads alone represent over 10,000 hours of work. This was a society with ceremony, with hierarchy, with meaning. These were not desperate animals running from the cold. They were complex human beings living rich social lives inside the storm. And they won. That is the part that should stop you. The glaciers retreated, the megafauna disappeared, the mammoths, the woolly rhinos, many of the very animals your ancestors had built their survival around. And your ancestors adapted again. They always adapted. The wind still comes at you sideways sometimes, in a parking lot in winter, on a morning run before the sun comes up, in any moment when the cold bites hard and the body wants to retreat. And somewhere underneath that reaction, underneath the instinct to find warmth and shelter and other people, is 30,000 years of inherited knowledge. Your ancestors stood in a world that was genuinely trying to kill them, and they looked back at it without flinching, bone needle in hand, fire already burning. That was never a disaster. That was just Tuesday.